So blueberries. We tend to think of our fruit tree crops as kind of these eternal constants. I talk about figs and they've, been around forever. Even what we think of as modern hybrids, like the apple trees, you can still get Gravenstein apples. They were a variety that was originally hybridized back in the 1500s. So really, really ancient. Blueberries aren't like that. Up until World War I, blueberries were a strictly American phenomena, all wild harvested. They believed they could not domesticate them. In 1910, 1911, a lady named Elizabeth White, her father was a farmer of cranberries and wild harvest crops on the East Coast, New Jersey. She managed to talk him into getting a college education in ag, and she started making collections from the wild. She encouraged some of her workers to pick really good varieties and flag them so she could come and propagate them. And so she got connected with a gentleman named Fred Coville at Department of Ag, and they started trying to breed these things. And eventually Fred Coville moved his research operation out to Washington State, and that began the real big boom of Pacific Northwest blueberry production. So up until 1911, there were no specialized varieties. It was all just go out in the woods and harvest them. So a very, very modern fruit. So the contemporary blueberry is a woody shrub and pretty large. I mean, 6 or 7 feet is not at all uncommon, although they're often pruned just a little bit smaller than that. But in some ways, it behaves kind of more of a perennial. It's a plant that needs to be refreshed periodically. So we prune out old wood to allow new wood to develop, and then we thin for opening out the light and air circulation. We'll talk more about that near the end of the presentation. But so they're a shrub, but they're kind of perennially in behavior as well. Like very many commercial fruits, they will not accept their own pollen. There are exceptions. We'll talk about that in varieties. But for the most part, you need 2 or more different blueberry varieties for fruit to set. And you also need pollinators. These are bee pollinated, like the whole family of vacciniums are. You need those pollinators present during the flowering period. So commercially, they pollinate them with honeybees or with orchard mason bees. Bumblebees also do a fair amount of pollinating, though bumblebees sometimes will chew through and get the nectar from the underside rather than going through the pollen, because they don't fit into the flower very well. So pollination is important, and the good news is there's not a lot of genetic problems. Like with apples, there are certain varieties that don't cross with each other, or hazelnuts are infamous for how difficult it is to match up pollination. Blueberries are pretty simple. As long as they are blooming at the same time or have enough overlap of bloom time, and they're 2 different varieties, they will accept the pollen. You won't have any major problems, including from different species, and that's why there's so many hybrids out there now. So most of what you see in the Pacific Northwest, your traditional commercial blueberries, are what they call northern highbush blueberries. Now, northern highbush blueberries require a certain amount of chilling. There's some variation from selection to selection, but they require a fair amount of chilling to produce. This is why you don't see them being produced in California or Georgia or Florida. They can't do these types of blueberries here. So they're typically the most productive and best flavored berries and the largest berries available. And they are the backbone of the industry here. They are sometimes used to hybridize into other species for specialty varieties as well. In the South, you see southern highbush and rabbit eye blueberries. And there's also a couple other species blueberries that are involved, which are evergreen. And those are typically low chill requirement. They do really good across the Gulf, for example, in the Carolinas also. But they are not really well suited to our area. It's not like we can't grow them, and people do occasionally grow them, but they don't produce very well in our environment. They really are suited for a significantly much milder climate. Within those species and groups, hybridization happens on a regular basis. There's constantly, like all of agriculture and commercial horticulture, there's a lot of new varieties being developed all the time. And they're often intermixing either the northern and southern groups or bringing in other species of vaccinium and breeding them in to provide some desirable characteristics, whether that's from an ornamental standpoint or a production standpoint. So with that much going on out there, choosing a variety gets complicated. In general, if you're getting started with blueberries, I would recommend you just start out with the northern high bush, because all the literature is about them. That's where you find the most reliable information on growing them. They break up the production season on northern hybrids northern high bushes into basically 3 production seasons, as it were. So we have an early production cycle. Early production cycle usually starts mid to late June on a good year. Your mid-season is where the vast majority of the varieties come into production, and an early part of the mid-season might be 4th of July. The tail end of the mid-season is maybe late July, early August. They've been intentionally breeding for later and later production to expand the harvest season on blueberries, and you can't really do much on the front end of it because, again, flight of pollinators for berry production. You can't really get blueberry production into April or anything like that. Just couldn't happen. So they've been working later instead, and some of the late varieties start August. A few of them start in September, and they go well through September on the later varieties. There's a batch of good varieties out there. A sampling on the screen is very much a representative sampling only, and so there's a lot more out there. A few of particular note from the list. Early blue is widely produced commercially. It is, for my money, not the best early blueberry, but it's the one you're most likely to run into in commercial operations. Earlier varieties like Bluetta are available. For better quality early varieties, go just a little bit later into the season and look at varieties like Duke, which is a nice, big, mild berry, or Spartan, which has an almost perfect sweet tart blend. It's one of the few blueberries people actually come in and shop for by name at the nursery. But it is slower growing. It takes a lot longer for the bush to get up into production and up to production size. It's just a slower developing variety. In the mid-season, Berkeley's are considered widely nationwide the most popular variety. They're a nice powder blueberry with a medium to large size. They got a pretty good size, but they're not huge. Sweet with, again, just a hint of sharpness to them. Blue Crop is, again, your main commercial variety, though that comes and goes a little bit in fads. I'm a big fan of Blue Ray for that mid-season. It's a little bit bigger berry, and it's a heavy producer. Late season is always kind of a challenging season because with your later berries, the color on the berry develops well ahead of the sugar, and it's sometimes hard to tell when they're really ripe. So have patience and it will be well rewarded. Chandler is kind of the front end of the late season. It's like a mid to late transition in August. A gigantic berry, widely considered the largest blueberry on the market today, with a very mild, sweet berry. The other thing I like about Chandler is its length of production season. So most individual varieties produce for just a few weeks, but Chandler goes on for like 4 to 5, much more substantial harvest season. So it's not as many berries all at once, but spread out over a longer period of time. And for the home gardener, that's a huge advantage, though the commercial people don't particularly like it. Elliott is widely used as the kind of the late variety, and it's one of the latest varieties with production happening late August and well into September. Herbert and Ivanhoe are a sibling pairing that I really enjoy the flavor and fruit characteristics on, but they pick scar when you harvest. So when you pick them off the bush, you get a little tear in the top of that berry, which means they don't fresh store worth a darn. Eat them right away or freeze them right away, and they're great, but they're not going to hold in the refrigeration for any period of time. So those are some of the major strains of varieties out there over the course of the year. And as you can see in the handouts, or if you're online at home, you can go to our website and look at our handouts online as well. We'll cycle through maybe 20, 25 varieties in the course of a year because there are that many to play with, and all of them have some adherence and some unique characteristics. Once you get outside of the main sequence, there's some specialty berries for some specific purposes. The half-high hybrids are berries that were developed for a colder zone. They really don't provide any advantage here in the valley, except maybe if you're really high elevation. But they will survive much colder winters than we normally get. So blueberry production is kind of limited to Western Oregon and Western Washington on the West Coast, because everything east of the Cascades gets too cold in the winter for them. They really don't like 25 to 30 below zero. There are very few of the true high bush varieties that will tolerate that with reasonable success. But these hybrids readily tolerate this all the way down to USDA zone 4, so nominally 30 below zero climate. So they're less productive, but they expand your production range for blueberries. And most of them have north in the name or other northern references like Polaris, North Country, North Sky, North Blue are commonly available. They're not bad berries, they're just not the ideal berry for our climate. There's a number of high bush hybrids where they've crossed the American high bush, northern high bush blueberry in with either southern low bush, southern high bush, rabbit eye, or other blueberry species. A couple are, and there's a lot of them out there, a couple specifically of note that match up with northern high bush in terms of growing characteristics, meaning requiring a cross pollination and compatible with northern high bush, so you can mix them in with your orchards. Legacy is a late to medium late variety with a very big plant. 6 or 7 feet is not at all uncommon on them. That are very, very large, upright growing plant. Berries are good size, though not giant. They have a really good blend of sweet and tart with really good flavor characteristic. And the bush itself is semi-evergreen. They tend to, except for our coldest winters, they tend to hold leaf through the winter, giving them some ornamental value as well. There's no production benefit to that, but if you're growing a few around your yard, that can be a nice thing. Sunshine Blue is a short variety, about 3 to 4 feet, maybe hitting 5 feet, with lots of very small but sweet berries. It holds leaf late, but I would not class it as semi-evergreen for our climate. There are others that definitely are. Nocturne is kind of a new variety. It's a very complex multi-species cross with really good sweetness characteristic in particular, and kind of a late production cycle. Beyond the high bush hybrids, there's a whole lot of breeding that's been going on in blueberry in the last decade or so, producing a number of specialty varieties for the home gardener specifically, rather than for the commercial production. A lot of these, in fact, the vast majority of them, are self-fertile. You can throw a single plant in a whiskey barrel or a large pot and have blueberries on your deck. So some good varieties and there's a ton of them out there now. Some good varieties in that grouping. Perpetua, they class it as kind of an everbearing. What that really means is you got kind of an early crop and then a pause and kind of a late crop on them. But a very long production cycle because of that. The berries are modest. They're not really particularly large, but the flavor is quite good and one of the very newest introductions. For flavor characteristics, pink icing and peach sorbet are a couple of my personal favorites. And pink icing has a quite sweet flavor, where peach sorbet has a distinctively fruity overtone, which is not necessarily a characteristic of blueberry. They tend to be either sweet or tart. This one has some body to it. That's why the peach part of the name. Raz is another fun one in the hybrid group to play with. Raz produces a berry that, even though it is a blueberry, has taste characteristics that are more match up almost with raspberries, that definitely the tart end with some sweetness, very sharp flavors, kind of fun to play with. And then Jelly Bean is a little tiny guy if you want to put a little border planting around your patio, or again, one in a container on your deck at basically about 2 feet in size, with a good volume production of small but quite sweet berries. So lots of berries out there. There's lots. I get coming in. We got some hanging basket, sapphire cascade, midnight cascade. Ones that they're really tiny berries, but you can grow them in a basket. They trail down. Lots to play with out there, and they're all fun to work with. And this is a good area for doing these varieties. We do very well with them. So once we've made some ideas on selection of what you want to plant, let's talk about getting there from here. When do we plant? Right now, one of the reasons we host this class this time of year is that in February, we have bare root blueberries. And the big advantage to bare root blueberries is you can get older plants at a reasonable cost. They're typically either 3 or 4-year-old plants. So they're dormant, they handle really easily, and they're literally bare roots. You wrap them in damp newspaper and send them home, and you got to get them in the ground right away. You can plant all of spring, all through summer. The later you get into the season, the more likely you are to have some shock or stress reactions from planting. So that's something you want to be aware of for later plantings. But we do continually restock container-grown blueberries throughout the entire season, because you can literally plant them year-round here. Fall is almost as good as late winter for planting because the plants are dormanting down. The stress factors are really low, and they have an entire winter to push out new roots before the drought stress of summer. But in fall, we can't get bare roots, so you're limited to container availability. But we do carry a pretty good inventory of them in the fall as well. So volumetrically, how much do you really want? A mature, as in 8-year to 10-year, fully mature high bush blueberry can produce maybe 15 to 20 pounds of fruit in its roughly 3-week production cycle. That means for fresh eating, you want maybe 2 plants per person who is a significant blueberry fan. That gives you some to eat and plenty to eat, and some to store or freeze. If you're serious about freezing or doing preserves or other types of processing with blueberries, it's worthwhile to double that, maybe 3 or 4 plants per blueberry eater in the household. Keep in mind that they are big plants, so that may be a limiting factor for you. You really need to plant, if you're looking at a high density planting like they do commercially, you're planting like 4, 5, maybe 6 feet apart in rows 8 or more feet apart. In the home garden, people tend to plant them more individually, like 6 to 8 feet separated on all directions. Anything tighter than 4 or 5, you can't physically walk between them when they're full grown. They are that big of a bush, so I'll allow plenty of space. Blueberries thrive in full sun environments. They will tolerate a little bit of shade, but it's at the expense of production. So they can make a transition zone plant if you've got really sun-needing things like raspberries. They need a little bit less than that, but they will produce better in full sun. They need access to irrigation. Watering is a significant limiting factor for growing blueberries, and it's not just in the early part of the season when we're coming up to fruit production. It's even after fruit harvest, because that's when you're working on developing the buds for next year's crop. So a good rule of thumb on irrigation is 2 inches of water per week. So that means you're watering about twice as much as it takes to keep your lawn green. That's a pretty significant amount of water going on for blueberry health. They do require an acid soil. They're very particular about that. They don't process nutrients appropriately if they lose too much acidity, if they get too neutral or even alkaline. Their preferred range is between 4.5 and 5.5 on the pH scale. You can grow them at 6 without any major problems, but you're getting up around 6.5, and you're going to see that you have trouble keeping them fed and productive. Most of our soils in this area are not that acidic, so you're going to probably need to take steps to make your soil more acidic. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So, doing your planting. You want to prepare a hole. Now, this is a plant that you don't want to get waterlogged, despite it wanting lots of water in the summer. In the winter, it would prefer reasonable drainage. In addition, we're going to be mulching these on an ongoing and regular basis, and mulching right up over the stems. So it's a really good idea to dig a pretty shallow hole. You want to leave an inch or 2 of that root mass exposed above the top of your hole. So a shallow hole, but 2 to 3 times the diameter of the root mass. So on bare root plants, that means you're digging a hole maybe 10 inches deep and maybe 25 inches across or so. Mix in plenty of compost, plenty of organic material. We like to use an acid planting mix because it does 2 steps. It helps acidify the soil. It provides good biomass for water and nutrient holding. Often that's not enough in its own self to produce enough acidic conditions for the blueberries. You probably are going to need to do some degree of soil acidification, at least at planting, and pay some attention every few years as you go through that it's not drifting too neutral over time. We use elemental sulfur because it's the only organic source we have for acidifying the soil besides decompositional cycles themselves. It takes time for acidification to happen. So what we're normally doing is we're putting 2 to 3 ounces of sulfur per plant in the hole. And where possible, we would love to see that happening 4 or 5 months before you plant, because it takes time. It's the chemical processes that happen to that sulfur is what causes the acidification, rather than just dissolution of the sulfur itself. So you can do it at planting, that's fine. You can do it after planting. Just be aware that you might be struggling a little bit that first growing season, getting enough nutrient uptake if your soil isn't really good. So yeah, we'll plant these plants in these acidified soils 1 inch or 2 exposed above the root mass above the top. And we'll fill in with the soil that we've amended, where we've used the native soil, and mix some compost in. Put a good layer of fertilizer in. Again, we use an acidifying fertilizer usually, and a rhododendron camellia azalea food, an organic rhodi food, does really nice for blueberries. And then you need to mulch them. So for 2 inches shallow, we're going to mulch them about 4 inches over the top. So we're going to have the 2 inches of the top of the ground completely buried in mulch. So it takes a pretty good amount of compost to get these in the ground. Now, you're used to seeing the blueberry orchards around here. And what do? They use sawdust. Can you do that? Sure, sawdust and bark dust work fine for soil acidification, nutrient and moisture retention, and weed suppression, the characteristics we're trying to accomplish here. But they're incredibly nitrogen negative. The woodier the product is when you're putting it down, the longer it ties up nitrogen out of the soil. So they do this commercially, and then they feed very high nitrogen fertilizers on a regular basis to make up for it. That's a viable approach. For home gardeners who are putting in 3 or 4 plants, they do it because it's cheap. You can get sawdust cheaper than you can get compost. You can get agricultural ammonia-based fertilizers much cheaper than you get organic fertilizers with nitrogen. For the home gardener, I'd just as soon see you do compost and rhodi food rather than bark or sawdust and high nitrogen synthetic fertilizers. So, but either approach is valid. They're just fine. So, blueberry care, once you've got them in the ground, you will need to fertilize. The ideal fertilization process gives them an ongoing supply of nutrients through their flowering and into their fruiting season, and also during their vegetative growth cycle that happens after the flower development. So we like to feed them 3 times in lighter doses rather than 1 huge dose all at once. So we feed either March, April, May, or April, May, June is suitable with an organic granular fertilizer. Ideal fertilization process, this becomes critical if you're using woody compost, but it's also not a bad idea even if you're using just traditional bagged compost or broken down compost, is to pull the top layer of mulch off, put the fertilizer down, and re-mulch. Now, using a finished compost, that's not such a big deal. Beneficial, but not so critical. But with woody products like sawdust, that is critical, because where the nitrogen stealing is happening is right at that interface between the soil and the mulch. So you've got to get that fertilizer down there where it can be used. So there's some labor involved in doing this, raking back compost, feeding and raking it back over, but it's not horribly difficult to do once you get into a routine of doing it. It's a good idea to keep an eye on your soil pH. Soil pH changes depending on biological processes and the amount of water, and you're running a lot of water through blueberries. So if you're starting to drift up into that 6 range, put another dose of sulfur on. If you're really good about feeding 3 doses and mulching with something that's already acidifying, not something that's been pH balanced, you may not have to do that often. But ultimately, you're keeping attention to it, and you'll want to do it. Now, blueberries can be in production for a very long period of time. These are not blackberries and raspberries that age out pretty fast. Commercially, they run a planting for maybe 20 years or so, and then they dig those mature plants because the yield is starting to diminish, and they sell them to home gardeners for another 20 to 30 years of decent production, but declining. So you have that potential for a 30, 40, or even 50-year production out of blueberries if they're well cared for. So it does make sense to pay attention to some of these factors and make sure they're staying healthy. Consistent watering is critically important. So this is for yields, but this is also for overall plant health and for production the following year. 2 inches a week during the dry season is considered the standard. And that is a lot of water, so be aware of that. Measuring inches of water can be kind of complicated. There's no better method I know with overhead irrigation than putting a tuna fish or a cat food can out there. Turning on your irrigation, when you fill that, that's an inch of water. So a wave action sprinkler, that's like an hour, 45 minutes to an hour run time is an inch, 2 inches a week. Best not to try to apply it all at one time. Do 2 or 3 applications over the course of the week where practical. Drip watering works for blueberries, but you pretty much have to incorporate multiple drippers or drip tubing that's higher flow rates, because you need to put that water out over the entire root system of that plant. It's a fibrous rooted plant with a fairly broad, shallow root system. So putting 1 or 2 individual drippers doesn't do a really good job on blueberries. They're better served with collars of drippers or laser soaker that actually has some spray to it. Agriculturally, they use drip tape where they punch holes in it and puts a higher volume of water out, that kind of thing. But higher volume applications are better than super low volumes of application, because it's got to be dispersed, and because what's happening 1.5 feet under the ground doesn't really matter to blueberries. They don't root down there. Their roots are all up in here. Weed control is very important in blueberries. They don't like the competition for water and nutrients. So hand weeding is the rule of thumb, because you're down there in the stems with green tissue in the stems and leaf mass, and herbicides are not at all practical for that application. So keep them well weeded. The mulching helps a lot. Not a cure-all, but it helps reduce the weed problems. In the course of taking care of your bushes, you're going to be doing some pruning. We'll talk about that in a moment, and possibly some spraying. And you're going to be doing the regular spring feeding. Somewhere in that cycle, make sure you put a fresh dose of mulch over the plant. So that mulch will do a couple of things. It will keep a constant layer of active biological mulch on top, where you're holding nutrients, holding water. It will suppress weeds to a reasonable degree. Big thing it does is it suppresses diseases on the plant detritus that's sitting there on the ground. And blueberries get a fair number of diseases. It's well worth suppressing them that way, in addition to or instead of spraying on a regular basis. Cleaning up at the end of the harvest cycle is very important. Some of the more serious diseases like mummyberry are best controlled not by spraying, but by good sanitation and mulching practices. So, critters. Critters love blueberries probably more than you do. They're a real problem. Deer don't bother the berries much, but they love blueberry bushes, and they eat them pretty heavily. You're probably going to need to protect them if you're in deer country, with a fence for the area or individual nets over the bushes. And they're a big enough bush, it's a little bit of a challenge to net well. There are repellents out there for deer control. They work so-so if you keep on top of them. They're not perfect, and you do have to keep on top of them because they wear off, but it is an option. Birds are the biggest problem in commercial blueberry operations. You know, you look at 40 acres of blueberries and they don't fence them. The deer get into them and browse them a little bit, no big deal on that volume of plants. But the birds are a disaster out there, because they will eat all the fruit just before it's ready to harvest, typically, just right as the bricks count is coming up. So scare tape can work, flash tape or other types of deterrents. Commercially, they sometimes use acetylene cannons for the boom to scare them away. Yeah, me too. But flicker tape is a fair approach. You just can't put it out too soon. Birds get used to it pretty fast. So putting your flicker tape out about the time that you first start seeing berry color on your berries gives you a reasonable chance of at least getting some of that fruit off before the birds get to it. Other than that, netting again is your approach. Voles and gophers are a serious problem even in the commercial operations, because they eat and damage the root systems and the stems of the blueberry. Gophers are usually controlled by trapping. You can usually, if you're keeping on top of it, manage them that way. Voles are much harder to trap out. The reproductive rate is so fast, and the populations get so dense, it's really hard to just trap them out. I advocate strongly for using deterrents, and the best deterrents for voles are keeping the weeds down. Everything in the predator world eats voles, so they spend their entire life running under the grass, under the low plant material, sometimes under the mulches, to get to roots and stems that they can eat. So keeping weeds clear as much as possible in the area around your blueberries will deter voles from finding them. Encourage raptor predation. Your hawks and to some extent owls are huge rodent predators for voles. They get more voles than any other predator out there. If you look at the Andersons out there north of town, you notice he's got these big poles out there with these big old dead branches mounted on them about 40 feet off the ground, 30 feet off the ground, something like that. Those are raptor perches. They're encouraging hunting raptors to sit there and wait and look for prey. And that will help. It's not a cure-all, it will help. Short of that, if populations get out of control, you may have to resort to baiting, and I don't like having to bait for rodent control, but it will maybe come to the point where you either do that or you don't raise blueberries in some situations. Pests and diseases, prevention is worth everything. Control is challenging. Unfortunately, not all things can be completely prevented, so we do sometimes resort to controls as well. Effective sanitation of fruit and leaf debris at the end of the season is very, very important. Proper pruning is very, very important. It not only retires older wood, and it also tends to open out the plant for air circulation, reducing disease problems. A fair number of the diseases, there's leaf spots, stem cankers, mummy berry, blights, powdery mildew. There's quite a number of them that get into blueberries. A lot of them can be suppressed or moderated at least by good mulching and good sanitation practices. It's not a bad idea, particularly if you're fighting some problems, particularly with some of the cankers and leaf blights that are a little more persistent, to resort to copper fungicides. It's a pretty common approach for them, just like you would on a fruit tree as a dormant season spray. You can't use copper mostly during the growing season because the berry production, it's pretty hard on flowers, it's pretty hard on the berries themselves. Once we get past the flowering stage in the spring, you do have the option of using organic fungicides, Serenade, or similar biological fungicides. I think Serenade is pretty well coming off the market. We use Monterey Complete disease control these days. So these are bacterial fungicides. They're weak. I wouldn't rely on them for my entire disease control regimen, but you can use them through the growing season as needed or for improved control. So blueberries get a number of minor pests. Leaf rollers are relatively minor. Azalea leaf skeletonizers can be worse. Aphids, mites. Watch for them, control them as you would on any other plant. The more modest insecticide, the better. Insecticidal soaps, neem, pyrethrin are all suitable controls. We have two significant in-fruit pests on blueberries. We have the fruitworm, cherry fruitworm, and we have spotted-winged Drosophila, the new introduced fruit fly. So there's one basic cycle on the fruitworm, and unfortunately on blueberries, that's right at the end of flower. So you have to focus your controls right at the end of flower after the bees are down or doing evening applications when the bees are not flying. Spinosad or BT are organic insecticides that are very effective for controlling these moth and fly larvae. Spotted-winged Drosophila is a little more difficult. It's a multi-fruit pest. It attacks a wide range of different fruits. It has a very long cycle because there's many, many generations per year. On blueberries, they tend to come in just at hint of color before the full sugar develops. So if you're having ongoing problems with this fruit fly, you need to time your sprays according to that, which means different varieties will have slightly different spray schedules. And if you're doing a mixed orchard, you might be starting to spray in June for them and continuing to spray through August or September every couple of weeks for good suppression. So it's a problem. It does quite a bit of damage to the crop, and it's sporadic. You'll see them. Some people have a lot of problem with it in the area. Others have very little problem with it. But it is a flying pest, so it's likely to spread around more. And it's become a real disaster in commercial orchards as well as home gardening the last decade or so. Pruning blueberries is probably what we get the most questions about. It's kind of a somewhat complicated topic once you get into a rhythm on it. It's not difficult to do, but it does require a little bit of eye to it. Why are we pruning? Well, a couple of things are happening. First of all, we need new, refreshed growth for productivity. So what happens on an older stem once you get beyond that 4 or 5 years old, it's not like they stop producing. It's like they overproduce. They start putting more and more berries on that old stem and very few leaves, to the point where they start straining or stressing the plant's production ability. So we retire those older branches to promote new growth coming out that can maintain productivity. We're also trying to get rid of obviously diseased, cankered, damaged, broken wood. And we're trying to open up for air circulation and light penetration for better ripening and for disease reduction. Pruning on blueberries is done during the dormant season, usually about the time the buds are swelling. So again, now, January, February is real normal. You should be done by the 1st of March with any blueberry pruning. That's kind of pushing the late end of pruning on blueberries. So the best productivity is is off of 1-year-old wood and the growth that came off of that the previous season, but they maintain good productivity out to about 4 to maybe 5-year-old. So when we're looking at a young bush, all we're literally doing is taking 1 or 2 old stems out to encourage plenty of new growth to come out to replace it. A good rule of thumb is to have maybe 2 or 3 viable, good, healthy, younger branches per year of age. So if you look at like a 2-year-old blueberry plant, the 1-gallon container is usually a 2-year-old blueberry plant. At this time of year, you might take a branch out or 2 at most. You need to be feeding, watering, and mulching enough that you're getting lots of growth to select from in the subsequent years. If you're doing marginal care and you go through and you try to remove 2 or 3 or 4 stems on a 4-year-old bush, you have nothing left because they're not putting out enough new growth. So there should be new growth coming out from ground level, multiple stems coming out. So as you get to like a 4-year-old bush, you're removing 2 or 3 of the oldest stems. And that's a point in time where the pruning starts really getting significant. 4-year-old plant, you want to have 8 or 10 production stems and nothing else. You want to be slowly increasing that stem count a little bit as you get older and older from there, but still cycling out the oldest stems. So by the time you're at a 10 to 15-year peak production plant, you might have maybe 15 or 20 stems, and you should have nothing older than 4 or at most 5 years. So it's this constant rejuvenation pruning. So process. First of all, getting in there, look at the bush, take out any visibly broken, diseased, damaged, otherwise non-viable branches. You'll notice that besides having some really robust growth coming out from ground level, you'll also have some wispy stuff, either low branching off of those uprights or coming out from ground level, but it's little stuff. It's less than your pinky in diameter or even less than a pencil in diameter. Stuff like that you could thin out to help open out. So small unbranchy stuff down low. Branches that on the main production canes are getting long enough that when they have fruit load, they might actually droop down and onto the ground or into the aisle where they're no longer, where they're at risk of breakage from just maintaining the plants, could also be cut out. Then go through and age your stems that you have left and figure out what you need to take out from oldest wood. If you've been working this bush for a while, you've probably got a pretty good idea of what stems are what. When the stems begin to bark, so stems are very clean and glossy year 1 and 2. By 3, they start developing a little bit down low. By 4, they're starting to bark well up. By 5 or more, you've got a lot of bark on the stems. Anything that's significantly barky is old enough to be a candidate for removal. So once you've got, always when you're doing that, try to keep an eye towards air circulation. You might find that you have several options of stems to leave or take. always focus on opening out the center, so you're developing kind of this open vasey shape overall on the bush. After you've done removing your aged canes, do any additional pruning of younger canes that bring us down to a proportional ratio and help open that center out. So ideally, like I say, at 10 to 15 years, maybe 15, 16, 17 canes, varying in age from 1 to 4 or maybe 5 years old, and roughly proportionally distributed over those ages. And that's what you're going for. It's harder to express verbally sometimes than it is to simply do, and there are great diagrams online for doing this. But you see, we did even a little YouTube video on it as well. It's worth perusing. But the key here is the refreshing growth. That's very important. So harvesting of blueberries is a learned thing. Blueberries produce in clusters. The cluster does not ripen uniformly. So you'll get up there and you're working these berries, and some are coming off and some are not. With a little practice, what you'll get used to grabbing a whole cluster of berry and just kind of rolling with your fingers and thumb, right? Berries that are really ripe will detach under just a light pressure. You should not be pulling berries off the bush. If pulling berries off the bush, they're not ripe yet, or they have a disease that's preventing detachment. It's a physically learned skill. It's not too difficult once you get into it. You want to go through and pick those blueberries a couple of times a week during their 2 or 3 times a week during their production cycle, so that you don't have berries that are over aging out and you can maximize your yield. It's best to pick during the cool parts of the day. They get softer and softer as the weather heats up. That happens particularly on the later varieties when it's really hot. And so get them into refrigerated storage quickly or freeze them, but they don't hold at room temperature for very long. That's the keys for preserving them. So that's what we had for a basic blueberry presentation for you today, and I would be happy to take questions either from the room or from the online guests. With the audio in here for my online people, it might be better for you to type it in the chat, but I'm also willing to listen. So any questions?
So to make a hybrid, it may sound silly. When you want to create a new variety, you're taking the pollen from one to the other, and then you're taking the seeds out of that and putting it in the ground to make a new plant.
Yes, that's correct.
Grafting anything onto something.
No, that's correct. So when we talk about them developing new blueberry varieties, it is a sexual breeding process where you're transferring pollen from one variety, from a male plant to the ovary of a female plant, marking, usually protecting the flower, and or letting the fruit develop out. Then planting the seed and developing up from seed a new plant. And 4 years or 5 years after that, you might have your first significant amount of berries to see if this is a desirable cross. Because they are sexually reproduced, you would do a lot of them, or you would even let them open pollinate, save some fruit, and plant those out and see what you get. And a lot of blueberry production has not necessarily been heavily intentional crosses, but are accidental crosses or open pollinate crosses that they fruit them out, they plant them, they let them develop desirable characteristics. But when you're going for specifics, like in some of those interspecific crosses, things like that, yeah, controlled pollination, select the fruit, plant the seeds, see what you get in a few years from now. This is why introduction of new varieties is such a complex thing in fruit world too. There's no shortcuts to this, and like apple trees or whatever, yes, you get a seedling from that crop, and then you graft that seedling onto something with an older root system so you can speed up the process, but you might not know what you've got for 6 or 7 or 8 years or more, if it's going to even be worth following up with. So it can be a process. Yes.
I have 2 questions. What's the technique on adding sulfur?
So sulfur is normally for best results is lightly incorporated into the soil surface or mulch surface that you're trying to acidify. There's a reaction process that needs to happen, and that takes the acidification in that layer working slowly down. Burying it deep doesn't do any good, and putting it just on top doesn't do any good. It needs to be lightly incorporated.
Okay, and then the second question would be, so when you mulch, should you pull all the old mulch every year and then add all new mulch, or should you continue adding year after year?
So the question is, with mulching, are we going to strip the old mulch out and refresh, or are we just going to add on top? You simply add on top. It decomposes over time anyway. If you look at the orchards when they're using sawdust, which of course is slower to break down, and they don't necessarily mulch every year, though some of them do. They've got these piles of sawdust with these crowns coming out of them, so they're burying those crowns quite a ways down. Blueberries don't resent that as long as the soil drains, but you want to keep adding more on top. You don't want to take the old away.
But in order to do the sulfur, then you need to do that.
For the fertilization, if you're using woody product, you need to really get underneath it. So you rake it back, but then you rake it back over again. So what happens, I'm going to take just a bit more on this question specifically. What happens with fertilization and decomposition cycles? So you've got, let's say you put an organic mulch on a compost mulch that's got a little bit of woody material in it. And the bacterial organisms in the soil that are finishing breaking that down to where it's no longer compost, it's soil. They reproduce to meet their food supply, and to reproduce, they take nitrogen out of the soil surrounding, right? So one of the worst possible things you can do in any mulching situation, this includes putting leaf mulch on your vegetable garden, is put a protective mulch on, let biology start happening, and then take that mulch away and throw it away. Because now you're taking all that nitrogen that was utilized and you're getting rid of it. And with natural decomposition cycles, they go through boom and bust cycles, but as those organisms that are breaking down that material age out and die off, they return that nitrogen to soil. It's not gone, it's locked in a biological cycle. So leaving it there to be released as the natural mortality happens is the ideal.
Okay.
And for sulfuring, you can be under, but you don't necessarily need to or want to be right in contact with the roots. You can be right in that upper layer of mulch is fine for sulfuring, or you can do it as part of your feeding cycle while you're in between. I normally don't rake my mulch all the way out to like bare root the tops. We're just trying to get down to that layer where the fertilizers can do some good.
Okay. And then how about adding coffee grounds?
So coffee grounds can be an additive. If you can get enough coffee grounds to keep your plants happy, I'm happy for you, but that takes a lot of coffee grounds. Coffee grounds are significantly acidic, and they have some nutrient value. So not a bad approach at all, but usually in supplementation to other feeding methods. Yeah. Got a question online. Okay, so older established plants, you want to cut out barky canes and leave up to 10 to 15, correct? As this will force new canes that will grow up and branch. And that is exactly the idea. With an older established plant, you want to selectively remove the oldest stems, which usually means if you've been maintaining this plant ongoing, you're taking out 3 or 4, maybe 5 branches or so of the oldest branches out. That removal of those old branches coupled with good fertilization and watering will encourage a lot of vigorous growth coming out and giving you good material to work from next year. That's absolutely correct. All right, anybody have anything else for me?
So in commercial orchards, there's a wide range of herbicides and sprays, as far as I understand.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking that blueberries are kind of up there in terms of what they consider the, when you want to call it dirty dozen or something, up in terms of what they might use on the pests.
So let's talk about relative degrees. The question is about how much commercially, how much product is used, pesticide products in particular, on blueberries. There's a fair amount, but compared to other orchard crops, I would not say it's excessive. I mean, I worry more about a lot like apple production, unless you're intentionally organic. They actually spray them more than they do blueberries typically. Herbicide use, yeah, that is done quite a bit. For the most part, there's actually a fairly limited amount being done on blueberries as far as serious pesticides, malathions, gluthiones, these products. Yes, there's some. That's really more gone by the way, I think, even commercially, than it has in tree orchard production. There's a lot of use of pyrethroids and neem, even in commercial production, and various forms of spinosyn is very effective for the particular pests they get. So spinosyn insecticides are, okay, so if you look at BT, it's a bacteria. As it gets inside the host body of the insect, it reproduces, it gives off bacterial protein toxins, and that's what kills the bug, is the bacteria living inside the bug, reproducing and giving off these toxins. spinosad is those protein toxins produced through the process of sugarcane fermentation. So you're just simply introducing the bacterial toxin directly to the insect. So it's a little more stable than BT itself, got a little more duration. Neither of these are particularly bee friendly. They don't kill bees that are foraging, but if you get enough of it during pollen and nectar gathering, it goes back to the hive. This is both BT and spinosad. And you can actually have a pretty significant impact on hive health because they kill larval insects. That's what they do. The good news is once we're outside of flowering cycle, there's probably nothing else in the immediate vicinity of your blueberry that's flowering. We typically keep them pretty clean. And these insecticides are very safe in a relative sense. They're organic insecticides from a biological base. So spinosades are getting quite a bit of use now agriculturally as well as in the home garden with good reason. But yeah, I mean, they do get a fair amount of product. They get a lot of fertilizer. They feed them a lot of ammonia, synthetic fertilizer, a lot of ammonia-based fertilizers, ammonium sulfate for the acidification and the high nitrogen load. That bothers me probably more than most of the spraying they're doing. Although you do see orchards still using malathion for fruitworm, and that can be a problem, absolutely. Question online, do you need to prune out any little stuff up the canes if it's not damaged or diseased, or will the plant maintain a good balance of leaf and fruit buds? That is kind of situational. So you will certainly see on a typical mature bush that there's a lot of fringy little growth that is a good candidate for removal because it's not in a viable production. It's either trapped in the interior, it's so spindly, it can't really support much production of those kinds of things. So some degree of cleanup for opening it is definitely desirable. Other than that, we don't spend a lot of time like clear limbing them for a clear trunk, no, but opening out the centers and taking all the little wispy stuff that's not viable production wood is worth doing, absolutely. All right, well, I think we'll call it a day on the class. I'm still here all day if anybody has any follow-up questions, so let me know. Appreciate everybody coming, and thank you very much.